In this video, we will take a look at a new feature available in Nerdio Manager for Enterprise version 4.2 called Dynamic Resource Recommendations and Filters. The reason we created this feature is to give IT administrators who are managing virtual desktop environments in Azure a curated, smart list of resources to select when creating host pools or deploying session hosts, or in general, working with the various aspects of their AVD environment. The concept behind these recommendations and filters is that Nerdio Manager will take a look at your preferred settings as to what it is, what type of resources you want to present when creating host pools and deploying session hosts. And based on their availability and based on their cost, display only the relevant ones. So what you'll notice first is under the settings menu, there is now a new page called Resource Rules. And if we open up these resources rules, you will see that there are several built-in resource rules that have been pushed out to everyone's Nerdio Manager deployment after upgrading to version 4.2. Let's take a look at what a resource rule consists of. So we can click on the edit button and see what it looks like. So first we have a name. In this particular case, we have something called general use AVD VMs, a description of what that is. There is a scope, and we'll talk about that in a minute of how to configure it. There is an option of whether or not you want costs of these VMs to be displayed within the selector. You have whether or not this particular rule is checked and available by default. And then you have the actual selection rules for both VMs and disks. In my case, disks are turned off. We're just doing this for VMs. We can select our processor, our VM family version, the VM family type. We can exclude certain VMs from the list. We can specify what cores or VMs with how many cores we want to show, and the amount of RAM that we want these VMs to have, what type of local storage, and how we want to display the VM availability, whether we want to display based on general availability in an Azure region, or if we want to take into account the CPU core quota. And then we have a sorting order that you can specify. So we're going to sort in this case by CPU cores, then by version, then by cost, and finally by family. So this is a default rule that's going to be enabled by default or selected by default. And let's see what the effect is of this particular rule. So if we go to any of the workspaces and we go ahead and click on adding a new host pool, what you'll notice is under our VM size selector, if we click the dropdown, you'll notice those rules that we saw on the previous page are here. The one that was selected by default is already checked, and the VMs in the list below are shown based on the criteria that we selected. So for instance, you'll see that we're only seeing the latest available version of a particular type of VM that we want to display, and it's only showing me those VMs that have available core quota in my actual subscription in the Azure region, which I've chosen by selecting the network above. You'll see that it's sorted by the number of cores and also by the price. So you can see the cost of that VM on a per hour basis, and you can see how much it's going to cost you. Again, this is based on Azure list pricing. Obviously, the cost is actually dependent on how long the VM is running, but this is the list price to give you a relative comparison. So all of these VMs are listed based on the conditions. All the other VMs are below, but they're grayed out. And if you mouse over them, it will actually show you why they happen to be grayed out. Like for instance, here it says, well, this VM is not shown because it's not the latest version, because this is version 5, and I have the same VM of, I'm sorry, this is version 4, and I have the same VM of version 5 available above in the list. If I wanted to select some other VM that's not in my default configuration, I can simply click all, and then you'll notice that all the available VMs become highlighted. If I want to focus on some other type of VM, for example, GPU VMs, again, here it will show me my specific ones here. I can focus on RAM optimized, CPU optimized, etc. So this is a built-in set of recommendation filters that will present a curated list based on availability and based on other conditions that we've created by default, but you can modify if you wanted to. Now, how would you modify a list like this? You would simply go back into resource rules. You would take one of the existing built-in rules, and you can clone it if you'd like, and then create your own with a different name and your own sets of conditions, right? So for instance, if you only wanted to see Intel VMs and you're only interested in version 4 rather than the latest, and you only were interested in, HPC optimized VMs, you only wanted to see VMs with 4 cores or 8 cores or 16 cores, but nothing smaller or bigger. You only wanted to see VMs with local storage and not take core quota into account. This is what your rule would look like. So we can give this a different name. Let's call it custom rule. And then we have a scope definition. So the simplest way to assign this rule is to display it anywhere where there is not an explicit rule that overrides it. We can also display it everywhere, regardless of whether there is an explicit rule that overrides it, or we can assign it to a specific workspace or a specific host pool, and I'll explain the use case for that in just a minute. So let's go ahead and create this rule and click OK. Let's jump back into our workspace. Let's go ahead and create a new host pool. And what you'll notice is we now have a new custom rule. Let's uncheck all the default ones. And now you'll see that we really don't have anything available because what we've selected, those specific HPC with 4, 8, and 16 cores aren't listed or aren't available in my subscription. So let's go back and edit this a little bit. And let's call it, let's say, compute optimize. Let's do general use instead of HPC. Click OK. Go back here and take a look at the drop down. So let's uncheck this. And here you go. These are version 4. Remember, we selected not the latest version, but we specifically wanted to see version 4. And then every other version or every other type of VM is grayed out. And we're only seeing the 4 and the 8 and the 16 core versions with all the pricing associated with those. Same thing applies to disks. We have some default pre-configured rules, and you can change them or create your own. And also you can see the costs and the types of disks that are recommended. For example, standard HDD is disabled because that's typically not used as an OS disk for a session host VM. Now, let's see how you can use these rules in a slightly different way. So let's go ahead and delete our custom rule that we just built. And let's say we want to limit the available VMs for a particular host pool that's being managed by one of the teams to specific VM type and specific VM sizes. So here, let's delete this guy and create something new. So let's go ahead and say add. We'll call this personal 2-core VMs. We're going to say show this at a specific scope. So let's pick this particular host pool from our dropdown of scopes. We will say show prices. We don't need to, and we're going to say selected by default. We are going to select VMs, and the specific VM is going to be an Intel VM, and we want to see only 2-core VMs, only with 8 gigs of RAM, and actually the one we want to see is the DS or say DDS V5. And now if we click OK and we jump back to our host pool right here, and we go to manage hosts and we say add session host, you'll notice that the only VM that's going to be available is the one we selected, right? D2DS, it's got 2 cores and 8 gigs of RAM, and everything else is grayed out. So you can use this also as a way of limiting and filtering out all the noise and only focusing your users on the the VM sizes when they are creating resources. And again, same thing can be done for OS disks. So if we wanted to use only premium SSD, or let's say only standard SSD disks for this particular use case. So here's our rule. We're going to go back here to edit it. We're going to enable OS disk selection rules. We're going to say we want it to be premium SSD, and we want it to be only 128 gigabytes. When we click OK, let's go back to this host pool, try to add a host to it. And again, you'll see that the only disk we now have available to us is the premium SSD disk. So an administrator can configure this at a global level, give access to a wider selection of VMs and disks at certain workspaces and host pool levels, and then limit that selection at other scopes. I hope you found this useful, and I look forward to seeing you in future videos.